So hello, everyone. My name is Ross Morales Rocketto. I am one of the co-founders and co-executive director of Run for Something. I think at this point, you probably already know what Run for Something is, but I'm just going to give like literally 2 seconds on it. We recruit and support young, diverse, progressive folks who are running for state and local office, usually for the first or second time. That's the intro I'm giving. This is going to be a really cool panel. We're talking about Democrats who are running in less than deep blue districts. We've got 2 awesome people here. We've got Senator Emily Randall from Washington State, and Representative Ricky Hurtado out in the great state of North Carolina. And we're just going to get started. Emily, if you just want to give like a quick intro, we'll get this thing kicked off.
Sure. As Ross said, I'm Emily Randall, the state senator from the 26th district in Washington. That's across the Puget Sound from Seattle on the Kitsap Peninsula, kind of rural area, and it's not on the coast of Washington, just for folks not familiar with our geography. I'm a queer Chicana, first-generation college grad, healthcare and education advocate, Planned Parenthood alum, now serving as the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee and as our Majority Caucus Whip.
That's awesome. Nice job. I didn't know that last part. All right, Representative Hurtado, you're up.
Thanks. Appreciate everyone being here this evening. I got a ton of jealous vibes just now, Emily, on the word majority. Oh my God. One day, we keep dreaming in North Carolina, but I'm Representative Ricky Hurtado. I am in District 63 in the House in North Carolina, which for folks that have any sense of geography in North Carolina, it's between the Triad and the Triangle. So think Greensboro, think Durham, the county that separates those 2 metropolitan areas is my district, Alamance County. I'm the son of immigrants. My family's from El Salvador and immigrated here in the 80s, fleeing the Civil War. I'm a first-generation college student and grew up in rural North Carolina. My background is in education and in nonprofits, and have been doing leadership development and education equity work for the last 10 years across NC and across the nation. And now I am serving the good folks of Alamance County in my first term. Became the first Latino Democrat to ever win an election and join the General Assembly in North Carolina. So historic election. Thanks, Run for Something, for the support. And now I'm on a number of committees, including the Environmental Committee, Land Use and Appropriations, but Democrats are still in the minority in North Carolina in both the House and the Senate. So fighting the good fight to beat back bad bills here down south. So appreciate being here tonight.
Thanks both of y'all. Really excited for this conversation. All right, we're just going to jump right in. And I'm just going to let either one of you jump in and take these as the spirit moves you. But the first question is, like, y'all are both in not the bluest of districts. Why did y'all end up deciding to run in these districts that are honestly a little bit harder?
Yeah, I'm already unmuted, so I'll go first. I guess put simply, if we're not fighting and winning in these tough districts, we're not winning anywhere, quite frankly. And so if we want to see the landscape of our national politics change, we have to start winning in places like Alamance County. And so after grad school, I made a decision I had a job offer to go do policy work in California. I was in New Jersey, or come back home to North Carolina. And after seeing the way politics was evolving in a place like North Carolina, which is, rapidly becoming a more rapidly purple state, you began to realize that, the fight was back home. And then I did move quite back home, which is in rural North Carolina, because you meet folks like your wife and, life plans change. But she also grew up in a pretty small town and a pretty conservative district just north of it in Alamance. And so I think the combination of my policy passions combined with figuring out what the landscape looked like in North Carolina, all it takes is going to one county commissioners meeting, one school board meeting, or visiting your legislators at the General Assembly, to where you sort of find yourself in a position where you say, why not me? Things have to change, and you don't see your lived experiences or your community really represented at the table. And so that was really the impetus for me of moving back home and seeing that, folks have to step up to see the change we want to see in North Carolina.
Yeah, so I really resonated with so many of those things that you said, Ricky. I mean, I I grew up in the district I represent. My parents grew up here, graduated from high school, in school districts that I represent now. And yet I never really felt like there was a legislator who was interested in my perspective, particularly as a young person with a background like mine. And so like filed that away, but didn't think that politics was for me. And then, the 2016 election happened. I signed up for a Run for Something call. I started thinking about where I could do more to be engaged in solving some of the problems like healthcare access that were so big and looming. And so thought like this district, this place, my home, my community is the perfect place for me to make change. And when I started talking to politicos, folks in the know who could open some doors for me, I remember one conversation with someone who said, "But you're a queer Chicana who worked at Planned Parenthood. Don't you think you're too much for this district?" And I mean, some people would be turned off by that. I mean, I think that's what they were just like, the intention was. But I felt okay. I see you, Ricky. I got kicked off. It looks like Ross got kicked off too.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was me. I think we're finally back. I hear you. I'm not sure where we left off either. I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know where I got cut off. I'll just wrap it up and say, like, I ran because people told me I shouldn't, and because my experience was not at the table. And we all have a job to do in making our system work better for all of us and representing all of us.
Yeah, no, I totally resonated with your comment about being too much, because I think it was one thing to hear or to see sort of your lack of representation at the table, but then I think I really made a decision to run when people started telling me that there's no way in hell that I could ever win in a place like my district. It's just like that, a young Latino could never win in a place like Alamance County. And so I think that for me sort of was a cherry on top, where like I've carried that chip on my shoulder my whole life and was sort of, up for the challenge at that point where wanted to prove folks wrong. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a part of the equation too.
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Actually, I'm going to go off script a little bit. I want to sort of dig in a little bit on that. Both of you are people of color. Like when a lot of folks try to recruit, and I know when a lot of folks try to recruit for districts that are tough districts, a lot of times they think about a white person. So can y'all talk about just sort of running as a person of color and sort of the things that you had to go through to convince people that I can actually win? And as we both saw, both of y'all did win. I think that'd be really interesting because we get a lot of candidates who run into that, especially in a lot of these redder areas.
Yeah. Well, I first want to sort of call out that I'm a pretty light-skinned Latina. And so my experience is different than, say, my friend Joy Stanford, who is a Black woman and ran in our community twice and lost. And the kind of barriers that existed for me are different than the barriers that existed for her and exist for particularly Black women candidates all across the country. But I definitely wanted to center my story in a way that allowed folks to make connections. So I was really thoughtful about how I used my grandparents. My grandpa is a Marine who chose to move his family to Washington State because they were facing housing discrimination in Utah, and where my dad grew up. And so they moved here when my dad was 12 and were looking for a welcoming community. Doesn't mean that they didn't escape, all of the racism that they were looking to escape, but definitely found community connections. And so I told those stories from my family that showed that we have more in common than we don't, that we share the same concerns about housing prices, broadband connectivity, being able to get the resources that we need to build, our family's futures. And I mean, that's kind of how race and identity played a role in my campaign. I will also say, like, I was a political fundraiser before, or well, I did some political fundraising, but was a fundraiser before this work. So was sort of used to having to make the pitch with people, which I think was helpful when I would sit down in one-on-one meetings and people would have doubts. My goal was always to leave the meeting by convincing them that it was their idea that I should run. So, I had some tools at my disposal, but also feel like those personal connections and those personal stories are really, really powerful.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Ross. I think for me, the first 6 months of my campaign, so I launched about 16 months before the election, July of 2019 for November 2020 election. Then the first 6 months, I feel like in many ways were the hardest because I had to run a primary race without having a primary opponent. Essentially had to convince the powers that be, local party, state party, important stakeholders in the community that I was a good fit for this district. And in many ways, you were never going to convince some people that a young Latino was a good fit for this district. You had to show them. And so we came out the gates running, and we raised a ton of money up front to show that we were serious about this and to also scare off real primary challengers, which is, not atypical. Pretty typical, right, in any campaign, any candidate running and trying to secure that seat. And I think those sorts of being able to show that you could also play the game, right, of like how to win a campaign helped provide ammunition in these conversations around how serious I was. And then you sort of have those, thoughtful conversations around how my lived experience connected to the lived experience of this district, which is a working class community that is really searching for its identity as it rapidly urbanizes in North Carolina. And so I think that the building blocks slowly built up. Some of it wasn't, fun, right? It was tough conversations. It was disagreements. It was, you wait, I'll prove you wrong sort of conversations. And some of it you just had to truck through, not let it really mess with you mentally, because, it is discouraging whenever you see folks that are supposed to be allies or even people in your own party doubting you, right? So you have to help them believe that winning is possible, because we've been burned so many times in a place like Alamance County. Have lost so many races, right? Like even their pessimism is sinking in, all right, what's even possible in a place like this? And so you do have to take them on that journey with you. And it takes time. And I certainly had to show some patience with some folks. But I think towards the end, after the first 6 months, and once we were in the general, and unfortunately also in COVID by that point, it got a lot easier. We broke through that initial barrier.
Yeah, I remember being at a donor meeting, and there was someone from a nonprofit in North Carolina there at the time, and we were actually having a conversation about your race and how we needed to endorse you faster. We had already been planning to, because people were trying to recruit someone like a white dude to run against you. So I still remember that conversation. All right, so for y'all, what were some of like the biggest, as you were thinking about running, as you were getting out on the campaign, like what were some of y'all's biggest obstacles?
I was actually going to talk about this very topic, right, around having to have these battles with your own allies before you could actually get into the big race. And I think that for me was the biggest obstacle, because it was really frustrating. It was demoralizing at times to have to justify your qualifications when it felt like there was no other candidate that was as qualified or ready to run as you were. And so I think that for me was one of the biggest initial obstacles around how we approach this campaign. I think the second layer to that then is like, how do you thoughtfully tell your story to a broad audience? And there being disagreements among your consulting team, around your kitchen cabinet, around your story and people's perceptions on how people receive that story. And so was I being too Latino by telling my immigrant story and my family's immigrant story? Like, what does that even mean, right? And so unpacking that and really getting to the root of people's fears as to what they thought other people heard and what was really our goal. And so that was, I think, a common theme that kept popping up in the beginning, in the middle, and towards the end of the election as people's nerves were getting, even crazier with how close this election was going to be, really being risk averse and fearful around what stories we told. And so, and to be quite frank, right, now being the only Latino in the legislature, that still holds true, right? Like, how Latino are you or are you not? Like, what issues do you stick up for? What do you not? And that being a constant voice in the back of your head, whether it's internal or the community of supporters actually talking about it, being a part of your everyday calculation.
Oh yeah, that only being the one who is supposed to represent everyone's diverse hopes because you share that identity is a lot. We have a small but growing MOCC caucus in the legislature. We talk about that a lot. So I guess I'll take a different barrier approach. In Washington, the more purple or red your district is generally means the tougher the map is, like physically, geographically. So I have a pretty big rural district. I have some urban pockets. I live in the biggest city in my district in Bremerton, but then there's like farmland and not reliable public transit and to get from one end to the other. And so figuring out how to be effective in field was challenging. Our first targets, we focused on more Democratic leaning folks. And then I would get back from days of canvassing and not having talked to as many people as I wanted to because the Democratic doors were so much farther apart. So we had to expand, who I was going to talk to. And I had to be comfortable with those conversations with folks who are much more right leaning. And I think it made me a better candidate and made us more effective to have that broadened targeting because, so much of how we win in these tough districts is having those individual conversations with people, meeting people at the doors. I think we learned from last election cycle that phones are not as effective. It's harder to reach people as those like in-person conversations at the doors, conversations, in apartment buildings that don't often get knocked, conversations down really long driveways where I would hear, no one but this previous congressman has ever knocked on my door before. But just putting in the mileage to do that was challenging. It's hard to, cover a big swath of territory and go to house parties and show up, to these events and be everywhere you need to be. But I guess it was also a joy of the work. So good and tough.
Awesome. Something that we hear a lot from our candidates and that there's a lot of conversation about is, especially for folks running in purple and red districts, is like, how do you balance your own personal values with sort of like the makeup of the folks in your district? And so would love to hear how y'all sort of think about that.
Yeah, always a thoughtful consideration every day, every week of the campaign and now serving in office. I think for me on the campaign, I'll stick to the campaign for now, is is we focus less on labels and on what was being discussed in the media, and we focus more on our value system and on stories. And I felt like many times, this wasn't always the case, but my values didn't always necessarily differ from the person I was talking to at the door that may have a different party affiliation, right? And I think that's the beauty of running in tough districts, right? Like it's not a corny campaign line anymore when you say like, I truly believe that there's more that unites us than divides us, right? Because you feel it and you see it at the doors every day. And so once you get the initial sort of, oh, are you a Democrat? And sort of like you get past that one line and you can continue the conversation, you begin to see the neglect and the dysfunction of government by design in places like Alamance County, and where so many people have been left behind, right? And so you usually leave those conversations maybe not secured with a vote, but at least with someone's respect that you're hustling to gain their vote. And people remember that in the rural parts of my district, in the even in the smaller towns and more urban parts of my district, folks are paying attention to who shows up. And more importantly, who doesn't show up. And so we have been leading with our values and leading with the stories that enable us to have some of the tough conversations when it does come time to, disagree on a certain policy issue. And I think that building those relationships with canvassers and with yourself out in the doors really makes a huge difference. And it's going to be what helps us cut through the noise in 2022 and beyond.
Yeah, so much of the same. So I'm just going to tell like 2 quick door stories. I mean, I would often get that, oh, I'm a Republican, as people started to close the door. And then I would say, but like, I want to know what the issues are that you care about, because if I'm elected, I need to represent you too. And 2 really memorable self-identified Republican stories include one person who said what they cared about was protecting our declining orca whale population, which is not typically a capital R Republican issue, but requires us to make really good choices about environmental stewardship and protections. And another person who felt like it wasn't fair that Jeff Bezos paid no taxes and he in his mobile home was struggling. And that is definitely an issue that we can connect about tax fairness, about making sure that the wealthiest among us don't continue rigging the system to benefit only themselves. And I think when you get away from the headlines and, the buzzwords, people are able to open up and share, what keeps them up at night. And so often we align on our concerns, and then we just have to work together to solve those problems.
Awesome. I love those stories, and I love the orca whale population. I hope we're protecting them. The last question, because we're running up on time, so go a little quick through these. What would you say to someone who's either currently running in a purple district or thinking about it as they consider making that decision? Like, what advice would you give to them, or what would you like to tell yourself? Sort of like a broad set of questions. You can pick one.
I'll do 2 quick things. One is just for personal advice. It's just like we have to lead with empathy, right? And we have to model the people in society we want to be a part of, right? Which means, not throwing any voter away and having those tough conversations, even if it doesn't lead to a vote, right? And the second thing I would say to anyone considering running is that the impact of our candidacies it outlives and is outsized to any particular race, right? So I think that even if I would have lost this race, it 100% mattered that I ran in Alamance County, and it affected the trajectory of our community. And I'm not just saying that because it was me, right? I'm saying that about all of us that run in tough districts, that we are having an impact up ballot, down ballot, and we're turning people out to make sure they're participating in this crazy experiment we call democracy, right? And so I think for anyone who's considering running in a purple district or even in an R+20 district, like run, like we need you out there. And like, this is a part of how we become the country we believe we can be.
Yes, totally. You know what? The one thing I'll add is that no one can tell you when you're ready or what seat you should run for. I think we both have experience with that. And what I learned from Run for Something early on was that you should think about what problems you want to solve and figure out where you can be best positioned to solve them and run for that seat, even if someone says it's too soon. The other advice I will give you is that I kept a sticky note on my computer and on my mirror that said, imposter syndrome is the cis hetero capitalist white supremacist patriarchy trying to tear you down. And I really think it's important to remember that. And I have had this belief underscored by this great article that you probably have read by Jodi Ann Berry, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, because it's all part of the system trying to take away our power as women, as queer folks, as people of color, folks who are underrepresented. Your voices as young leaders are really, really powerful and important. And I hope you recognize that. And I'm grateful to you for even thinking about running.
Y'all both rock. Thank you so much. We're at time. Thank you, Senator Randall. Thank you, Representative Hurtado, for your time. We really appreciate it. Y'all are both amazing. And I hope I get to facilitate another conversation with y'all at some point in the not distant future. And I think y'all will now be ushered back into the main room. Thanks, everyone, for participating. Really appreciate it.